Hi, I'm Mike, and today I will be explaining and demonstrating the Hard Sync feature of the Q106 oscillator from synthesizers.com. First, let's look at the System 44, and I'll describe the modules we will use today. First, we have the Q106 oscillator here that's going to provide the signal for Hard Sync. We'll call this Q16 the master oscillator. Master oscillator is getting its control voltage into the 1 volt per octave input here from the MIDI interface in the usual manner. We will use the pulse output here as the sync signal and the sine output here when we want to listen to the master oscillator's frequency. To the right of the master oscillator is a second Q106 oscillator that we'll use later in the demonstration for modulation effects. I will refer to this as the modulation oscillator, and for different demonstrations, this oscillator will either be free running or controlled from another source using the 1 volt per octave input. To the right of our modulation oscillator, we have a Q141 oscillator aid, which is connected behind the panel to the modulation oscillator. I'm using this to allow easy switching between modulation waveforms. You will not need this module in order to get the demonstrated effects, as you can achieve the same thing by simply connecting to different signal outputs of the modulation oscillator with a patch cord. To its right, we have the third Q106 oscillator that will be synced to the master oscillator. We will call this the slave oscillator. The slave oscillator will also get its control voltage into the 1 volt per octave input here from the same source as the master oscillator. For most of the demonstration, we will be listening to the sine wave output from the slave oscillator here with a signal splitter that will allow us to hear the waveform on the red cable and see the waveform on the yellow cable going to an oscilloscope. The sine wave is chosen for its pure harmonic content, which will allow us to easily hear any subtle distortions in the waveform. The slave oscillator will get its sync signal input here at the hard sync. And I have added a signal splitter here with the red cable coming from the master oscillator and the yellow cable going to the oscilloscope to allow us to view the sync waveform. To the left of the master oscillator, we have a Q125 signal processor that we will use to offset the sync signal for demonstration purposes later. The input is coming from the pulse output of the master oscillator, and the output is going to the hard sync input of the slave oscillator. Normally, you will not need this capability in order to use the hard sync function. Over on the oscilloscope, which is shown in the lower right corner of the screen, I will be showing two traces. The bottom trace is from the master oscillator and will usually be the sync waveform. On top is the slave oscillator, where we will see the effect of hard sync on the slave oscillator waveform. The audio you will hear is unprocessed and coming from the slave oscillator and occasionally the master oscillator. First, let's change our setup so we can see the master oscillator sine waveform and at the same time disconnect the hard sync input to the slave. This will result in two oscillators controlled in the typical fashion. Let's play a few notes on the keyboard while listening to both the master and slave oscillators producing sine waves without sync. We can hear there's a slight frequency difference between the two oscillators, and this is confirmed on the oscilloscope that shows the waveforms moving relative to one another. This is a typical patch that we're all familiar with, and adjusting the frequency knob on the slave oscillator will allow us to get these two tones very close. As we play across the keyboard, the frequencies may diverge somewhat due to tracking differences between the oscillators. Now let's reconnect the hard sync input of the slave oscillator to the master and look at the sync waveform on the oscilloscope. On the oscilloscope, the bottom trace is coming from the master pulse output. The oscilloscope is set to 5 volts per division with 0 volts here. As expected, we have a 10 volt peak-to-peak waveform. The upper trace is the sine output of the slave oscillator and is also set to 5 volts per division. The first thing we noticed is that the slave oscillator is no longer moving relative to the master oscillator. They seem to be at exactly the same frequency, and playing across the keyboard, they remain at the same frequency. Fundamentally, this is what hard sync is supposed to do. Or is it? In fact, hard sync does not make the two oscillators' frequency the same, though it appears to. What hard sync really does is to force the slave oscillator waveform to start when the master oscillator waveform has a positive going edge above a certain voltage. By slightly offsetting the frequency of the slave oscillator here, we see an interesting effect on the oscilloscope. The sine waveform is now distorted and it sounds different. As I adjust the frequency of the slave oscillator, I'm changing the timbre or sound characteristic of the waveform. Our ears are telling us that the slave oscillator is at the same frequency as the master, but its timbre is now different. So what's happening here? Earlier I said what hard sync really does is tell the slave oscillator when to start its waveform. With the frequency offset, it's now easy to see this. On the oscilloscope, we see that the rising edge of the master pulse output here is exactly aligned with the start of the sine wave here. In the Q106 oscillator, the sine wave starts at its peak, and one cycle of the waveform is completed when it reaches the next peak. The frequency of a waveform is defined as the inverse of the time it takes to complete this one cycle. For this example, I have intentionally tuned the slave oscillator slightly higher in frequency than the master. As a result, it is completing one waveform before the master completes one waveform. The sine is completing here, and the master is completing here, later in time. When the master again reaches its positive going edge here, the slave oscillator faithfully resets its waveform to the peak again here. The result is a new waveform that looks like a distorted sine wave and sounds quite different. To show this once more, I'll intentionally offset the slave oscillator to be lower in frequency than the master. On the oscilloscope, we now have a new distorted sine wave that sounds a little different. It's easy to see, though, that the same principle is happening. The master oscillator positive going edge is here, and the sine wave of the slave resets here. This time, however, the sine wave of the slave oscillator does not quite complete one full cycle when the master oscillator again tells the slave to reset here, and the slave faithfully resets to the start of its waveform here. This is how hard sync works. What makes hard sync particularly cool is that any differences in the frequency of the master and slave oscillator will result in a changing or morphing of the slave oscillator waveform. Therefore, the Q106 oscillator is capable of much more than the 5 output waveforms we see on the jacks at the bottom. You can construct endless new waveforms by just using HardSync. To demonstrate this, let's start by changing the range of the slave oscillator first higher. And then lower. And finally back to the same range. Each setting has produced a new and different waveform. Adjusting the frequency knob of the slave will further alter the sounds. If we manage to get the frequency of the slave adjusted to be the same as the master, something interesting happens. The slave waveform becomes a sine wave again. With a little thought, this is easy to explain. The master is resetting the slave exactly at the time when the slave was resetting its waveform anyway. To find this point precisely, it's good to use your ears, since the sine wave, with even the slightest distortion, is easy to detect with your ears, but harder to see on the oscilloscope. In a discussion with Roger from synthesizers.com, I sought to better understand the mechanics of how HardSync is working. According to the datasheet available online, we should use a, quote, pulse waveform from a slower oscillator into the HardSync inputs on a higher frequency oscillator. This, however, is not really a requirement or limitation. As Roger explained, the signal input must be a rising signal that is fast enough, and the slave oscillator reset will happen at a voltage somewhere between 0 and 5 volts. Now that's encouraging because all of the waveforms coming out of a Q106 cover the required voltage range, and some of them have very steep rising edges, like pulse and saw. So let's explore a little bit how fast and at what voltage we need to trigger the slave to reset it. Our slave is happily synced to the master right now, so the first thing I'll do is offset the pulse waveform from the master using the Q125 signal processor here. As I offset the pulse in a negative direction, I eventually reach a point where the master is no longer syncing the slave. We see and hear this change immediately. Slightly reducing the offset results in the sync working again, and increasing the offset stops the syncing from occurring. Now I'll zoom in on the pulse waveform so we can see the top. I'll change the scale to 0.5 volts per division and set 0 volts to the center of the screen. Zero volts is here, and we can see the tops only of our sync waveform. Now let's repeat that offset again and see more closely what's happening. We see the sine wave from the slave oscillator is not synced. Decreasing the offset on the Q125 signal processor, and right about there, sync is happening. We'll do that again. I'll increase the offset. It's not really synced, although it almost looks synced there. It's not really. Almost there, but not quite, and there it is. This appears to be happening around 1.2 volts. I repeated this experiment with the 5 other oscillators in the system and found this voltage to be between 1.0 and 2.8 volts. So be careful when you sync your oscillators and confirm with your ears that they are really in sync. Again, I recommend you use the sine waveform as it's easiest to hear any changes in the waveform shape. Once you confirm that you are synced, you can change the slave waveform at will and sync will be maintained. Now let's reset the scope to see the next waveform. Now let's put the offset back to 0 and change the sync waveform from pulse to a saw. I've chosen the saw since it has a fast rising edge also. We can see on the scope that the sync is happening, and the slave waveform sounds the same as when we had a pulse doing the sync. Offsetting the saw with the Q125 again causes the sync to stop at what appears to be about the same voltage. Next, I'll move the hard sync source to ramp wave here. Immediately we can see that the slave oscillator is not synced to the master. Adjusting the offset from the Q125 signal processor does not correct this problem. Sounds like it's almost synced, but it never really is. As Roger had stated, the rising edge of the sync waveform has to be fast enough. The ramp wave is a slowly rising waveform, but we can make it rise faster by changing the range of the master oscillator here. First from 16 feet to 8 feet. We hear a difference, but the slave is still not synced. Now let's change from 8 feet to 4 feet. That fixed it, but we're now limited to higher notes. In fact, playing down the keyboard will reveal when the ramp wave is not steep enough. So the ramp wave will work, but only under limited conditions. Continuing our experiment, let's switch to the triangle wave, resetting the range to 16 foot. We see immediately that the sync is not working. Switching to 8 foot results in sync working again. And again, playing down the keyboard, you find a point at which sync no longer functions. You can experiment with many waveforms yourself and determine where sync will and will not work. Let's now explore some more complex modulations that are sonically interesting. First, I'll set our master waveform back to pulse, as we've determined this will work reliably across the entire range settings of the Q106. I will disable and enable sync now by using the Q125 offset. This will be quicker than plugging and unplugging patch cables each time. With the Q125 offset, the slave is now pure sine wave, being tuned only by the keyboard. On our modulation oscillator in the middle, let's connect the plus output of the Q141 oscillator aid to the linear frequency input of the slave. Remember that the Q141 is connected to the modulation oscillator behind the panel. Playing a note and increasing the level of the linear frequency input creates typical vibrato. Now by turning sync back on, we'll get a much different effect. Increasing the frequency of the module oscillator will create a different effect. Playing across the keyboard will result in each note sounding different since the modulation oscillator is not tracking the keyboard. This can be fixed by connecting the modulation oscillator 1 volt per octave input to the keyboard. Finally, connecting the modulation oscillator Hard Sync to the master oscillator will yield a stable slave oscillator waveform. And changing the range and frequency of the modulation oscillator will morph the waveform. Pretty remarkable for just a sine wave. But we don't have to limit ourselves to sine waves for the slave oscillator. Let's change to a pulse wave and see what we get. Now it looks like we just get a pulse wave, with the pulse width determined by the modulating oscillator. However, now the slave oscillator range will have a dramatic effect as we change it. We now get a complex pulse wave with multiple pulses per waveform. Changing the modulation waveform from sine to pulse and the slave from pulse to saw produces even more bizarre waveforms. You can experiment here endlessly. For the final demonstration, we will modulate the frequency of the slave oscillator with a Q109 envelope generator instead of another oscillator. I have the sustain of the Q109 to 0 and the decay to about 2.5, resulting in this sound. Now I'll lower the slave oscillator range in steps. Lowering the range of the master to produce lower notes results in this. Finally, adding a little low-pass filtering with the Q150 with some resonance, and we're happily in tweak heaven. And that's all to it. Happy patching, guys. And please feel free to leave me a comment or question and any suggestions on future tutorial videos.